Thank you for joining us for this morning's session. Paperless AP for Dynamics SL. In this morning's session, you'll see a demonstration of how you can process vendor invoices, payment requests, and expense reports in PN3 with seamless integration into Dynamics SL. What do we mean by seamless integration? We mean that there are no files that you'll have to import or export to support the integration. PN3 runs over Microsoft SQL Server just like Dynamics SL. So all of your active vendors, your chart of accounts data, your project data, payment status of transactions, and budget data is seamlessly imported into PN3 without user action. PN3 also exports approved invoices, payment requests, and expense reports into Dynamics SL after they're fully approved based upon the workflow that you configure, reviewed by AP, and then they're passed over into unposted batches into Dynamics SL. Let's see a demonstration so that you can get a chance to take a look at PN3 to determine if it may meet your organization's requirements. I've logged into PN3 as Pamela Hood, an AP user. In this first example, Pamela has received an invoice in paper form that she'd like to route to a manager to get authorization to pay it. Pamela can scan a batch of invoices, but she can also say, I have a new invoice. PN3 will ask her to scan it or import it. I'm going to select Scan File. This invoice has been received in paper form. And Pamela tells PN3 that she'd like to scan the invoice in. I have a small scanner connected to my laptop. I've placed the invoice into the feeder of that scanner. So when I hit Start Scan, it's going to scan this invoice in and create an image that I can use to facilitate my approval process. Pamela says, I want to be able to track this invoice. I'm going to go in and I'm going to identify the header information for this invoice. First, Pamela says, I'm going to tell PN3 who the vendor is. This vendor information is coming from the active vendors that you have in Dynamics SL. So you don't have to worry about maintaining vendors in both systems. If they're active in SL, you'll see them in PN3. Pamela says, I'm going to tell PN3 what my invoice number is. I can type in or select my invoice date from a calendar. I'm going to tell PN3 what my invoice amount is, and that I'd like to route this invoice to a manager, Mary Jones, to get authorization to pay the invoice. Pamela could also code the invoice right now if she chose to. But in this example, I'm not going to code it now. I'm going to send it to Mary uncoded and let Mary code it as a part of the approval process. So I'm simply going to hit Save and Upload. You'll see the page refresh, and I'll get confirmation that this invoice was captured today. It shows the date and time by Pamela Hood, and it's been routed to Mary Jones. We also integrate PN3 with your email system so that we can send email alerts to staff when their action is required. So Mary will get an email alert to let her know that she needs to take action in PN3. Before I log in as Mary, because as I mentioned, I want to take this invoice through the approval process, I also want to show you other ways that you can get transactions into PN3. I'm going to open up our batch scan and import module. That's a standard configuration in the PN3 software. That says that instead of scanning a single invoice, I can scan a batch of invoices. Or I can go to a high-speed scanner on my network. I can scan there and import batches. We also have credit card import functionality. So if you have staff that have credit cards and you'd like to, instead of routing paper statements to them to confirm those charges, to code them, to give you supporting documents, we have an import of credit card charges and a workflow around that to make that process paperless as well. We also give you the ability to import multiple invoices across multiple vendors in a single spreadsheet. One of our most popular modules is our eCapture module. This module says, hey, you're getting more and more invoices from vendors via email. We'd like for you to be able to automatically pull those into PN3. So what our clients do is that they create an email address. They call it AP or payables. We configure PN3 to monitor that email address. It could be whatever email address they decide to use. They let their vendors know that instead of sending us paper, we would prefer that you sent invoices to us via email as PDF files. We configure PN3 to monitor the email address. When we see an email come in that has a single PDF file attached or multiple PDF files attached, we grab each PDF file that's in that email and route it to AP. So there's no envelope to open, there's no paper to scan. It becomes a fully electronic process. We give you the ability to go into your PN3 setup and tell PN3 where your vendors that are sending you invoices via email, where on their invoice is the invoice number, the invoice date, and the invoice amount, and we can grab that data off of the invoice to reduce your data entry effort. All you have to do then is submit the invoice into the workflow to initiate the approval process. Most of our clients tell us that they get about 50 to 60% of their invoices via email in eCapture, and they're scanning the balance. All right, as I mentioned, what we want to do is we want to walk through a workflow. So I'm going to now log in as Mary Jones. If you recall, Mary was the manager that we routed that first invoice to. Mary would have received an email alert. In that email alert is a link to the login page, and Mary logs into PN3. By the way, we can also integrate PN3 with Active Directory with single sign-on in many cases so that users don't have to be presented with the login page because we already know who they are. Mary, as soon as she logs in, we present to her her PN3 task list. Many clients like to call it their PN3 inbox. This task list shows 6 invoices awaiting Mary's action. This last one is the one that we just routed to Mary. Mary opens it up and takes a look at the invoice. I'd like for you to remember for a second that PN3 is a web-based application. Now, the software could be installed internally on your servers, or it could be a cloud solution. But in both cases, users are accessing PN3 from a browser. So they could be in the office, working from home, they could be on travel, and they can still participate in this process. So Mary can open up and take a look at the invoice from wherever she is. After opening the invoice, Mary has several options available to her because we've configured her as a manager in PN3. Maybe she looks at this invoice and says, not sure why this was sent to me. I don't deal with this vendor. She can select route, and she can route the invoice back to Pamela. If she wants to, she can even put in a note to explain why she's doing that. But as a manager, Mary also has the option of approving or rejecting the invoice. If Mary decides to reject the invoice, she can select reject. PN3 will require that she put in a note to explain why, and it'll send the invoice to AP. But as a manager, Mary can also approve the invoice and code it as well. Mary says, I'm ready to code this invoice. We integrate PN3 with your chart of accounts data in Dynamics SL. And we can show that data in a couple of different ways. In this example, I have a string that shows each of the segments and the corresponding description. Now, the vast majority of our SL clients prefer to have a field for account and then a field for the sub-account. And if they're using the project controller, we'll have a field for project and a field for task as well. The important thing to note is that we can integrate PN3 to present your coding data to users in whatever way you think is most helpful to them. And you'll notice that I started to enter the numeric values. It shows me a filter based upon what I've entered and the corresponding description. If I didn't know the numeric value, but I knew the description, I could type that in as well. Great for users that don't know your chart of accounts very well, but you want to give them the ability to code. You can also restrict a user's access to codes at the user level so that users don't have access to codes that they should never code to limit their ability to make mistakes. Now in this example, I'm creating a single line of coding equal to my $10,000 invoice amount. But as we know, that's not always appropriate. Sometimes I need to break this up across multiple invoices. Across multiple lines of distribution is what I meant to say. So instead of coding for 10,000, I could have coded to 1,000 and added another line and added a multiple lines. We don't give you any limit to how many lines of distribution or coding you can enter. We'll just run a validation that the sum of the lines equals the transaction amount. PN3 makes sure that your payment authorization policies and procedures are always being adhered to. Here's the first example of that. I've logged in as Mary, a manager, I've coded the invoice, and I'm ready to approve it. However, in this demonstration setup, Mary's approval limit is $1,000. This is a $10,000 invoice. We're still going to let Mary approve it so we can record that she approved it. However, we're not going to send it back to AP when she does. When Mary approves this, I'm approving it now, it automatically routes the invoice to Mary's manager because it exceeded her approval limit, and it then presents the next transaction that was in Mary's task list to her. Let's continue this workflow. So I'm going to sign out as Mary, and I'm going to sign in as Mary's manager, Susan. Susan would have received an email alert. She logs into PN3, and just like we did with Mary, we present to Susan her PN3 task list. This last invoice is the one that routed to Susan because it exceeded Mary's approval limit, and Susan was set up as Mary's manager. Just like Mary, Susan can see the invoice. But Susan can now see in the invoice processing milestones that Mary approved the invoice. It shows the date and time and the action that Mary has taken. Susan finds that very helpful. Now, if Susan has questions, she can use the invoice notes feature in PN3, and she can send a question to Mary and get Mary to answer her question, and their conversation will be permanently linked to this invoice. So if I open this invoice up 3 years later, I'll not only see who approved it and when, but I'll see any notes that were attached. Susan says, I want to do two things real quick. One, I want to check to see what impact this is going to have on my budget. So she selects budget info, and PN3 will pull the budget data from Dynamics SL. It will show her her annual budget, what's committed, the balance, what's pending, and what the balance will be if all pending transactions are approved. So Susan can see this information in real time without reaching out to reports and other information. Susan says, I also know that I have a contract with this vendor this year, and I'd like to see where we are related to that contract. So Susan selects Edit, and she links the invoice to the open contract for this vendor productivity. And when she selects Save, two things happen. We attach the contract document. The contract has been loaded into PN3, and so we automatically attach it to the invoice to make it easy for the user to hit View to see the contract if they'd like to. Susan says, no, I'm not really interested in seeing the contract. I want to see how much we've paid against this particular contract so far this year. So Susan selects Contract Info. It shows her the value of the contract, what's been paid, the balance, and when the contract expires. In an effort to improve process efficiency, we want to show as much information to Susan as easily as possible to assist her in making a decision. Susan says, that's great. That's exactly where I thought we were. I'm ready to approve this invoice. Susan selects Approve. Susan's approval limit is $25,000. It exceeds the $10,000 invoice amount. So that invoice is now fully approved and has gone back to AP. We now have presented to Susan the next invoice that was in her PN3 task list. Let's come back now over to our login as the AP user, Pamela Hood. We see that the invoice has returned. It's now a fully approved invoice, meaning it's been approved by a manager with the appropriate approval limit based upon your workflow. It now has a status of manager approved. Pamela can review it to make sure it's coded properly and everything is okay. And when Pamela is ready, all she has to do is hit approve. And PN3 will send the unposted voucher immediately to Dynamics SL in an open batch that Pamela might have open for the period that this invoice is designed to go into. There's no file to import into Dynamics SL. PN3 creates the unposted voucher automatically. And then we track that voucher so we can pull back payment information into PN3. I'll demonstrate what I mean by that in a few minutes. So that's a vendor invoice. By the way, we can do both PO and non-PO invoices in PN3. I want to also talk about some other transaction types. So I'm going to log in as Mary Jones, the manager that approved that first invoice, the first manager that approved that first invoice, I should say. We also have two additional transaction types in PN3. We have an expense report form. So I'm going to open that form up so we can take a look at it. So I've just logged in as Mary. Mary opens up the expense report form. We've linked her user ID to her vendor information, so we already know who she is. And Mary says, okay, I've incurred expenses that I need to get reimbursed for, and I'd like to enter them now. Mary can come in. She can put in the purpose of the trip. She could put in a date range, so she could say, you know, I had expenses between April the 1st and April the 29th. And she can enter her expenses. So Mary, for example, could say, you know, I had an expense on the 1st related to a trip that I had to Boston. This is a customer-defined drop-down list. So you control the drop-down values available to users. Mary could say, this is my airfare, and I flew United, and the amount of my ticket was $456. And then Mary could code that expense. Mary can hit Save, Copy, and Add to save that expense and enter an additional one. So Mary could say, you know, also on the 1st, I had a lodging expense as an example, and Mary could say, I stayed at a Hyatt, and this is the amount of, it's a pretty hefty charge there. Let's make this $1235. And I can hit Save, Copy, and add that one. For each of these that Mary adds, she can hit Add Document to attach her receipts and supporting documents. Or she could scan all of her receipts into a single file and attach that to the saved expense report. Mary can also enter her mileage. So Mary could say, for example, that, you know, I had, on the 1st, I had to drive to the airport. Sorry about my typing here. And Mary could say, I'm going to enter my mileage. Now you'll know that the rate is, notice that the rate is already there, because when Mary selects the date, the reimbursement rate that your PN3 administrator entered automatically populates. So all Mary has to do is put in her miles, and it calculates the reimbursement amount. So Mary could fill this expense report out. She could save it. She could come back and add expenses to it later, and when she's ready, she can submit this expense report into the workflow for approval, just like a vendor invoice. Once fully approved, it will route to AP. The last transaction type in PN3 is what we call the PN3 payment request form, formerly called the PN3 check request form. We call it payment request form now because, you know, many times payments aren't being made via check anymore. There are other methods of payment that are being used, EFT, ACH, wire. This form says, if I don't have an invoice from the vendor and I'm not going to get one, but I don't want to have to introduce paper into the process, I can use the payment request form. So I can come in as a user and I can tell PN3 who the vendor is. This again is a customer-defined drop-down list, so I could say this is a deposit and I need to try to get the payment by the 20th, and then I can create my form by putting in a description of what it is, the amount. I can code that. If I have another row, I can hit Save and Add, and I can add an additional row, but I can fill this form out. I can save it. I can attach supporting documents to it, and I can submit it into the workflow for approval. couple of other things I want to share with you. One of the things is you really need to make sure that, hey, you can manage the workflow. As you can imagine, at any given point in time, you might have a variety of invoices out there awaiting user action. And you want to keep track of those. One of the easiest way to do that is through what we call the PN3 Open Invoices report. This report shows you all open transactions. It shows you how aged each transaction is, who the vendor is, invoice number, invoice date, invoice amount, and the last column identifies whose PN3 inbox is it sitting in right now. All PN3 reports can be viewed online, can be printed, and exported to Excel. Maybe I'm a user and I'm curious if an invoice has been paid. Well, in the past, I had to pick up the phone to call accounting to find out. Now, I can go into PN3 and find out. Now, you can apply security to this if you want to control who has access to specific invoices. But if I have access to the invoice, I can come into PN3 and perform a search, and the invoice will return. So, for example, I said I'm looking for invoices for this vendor productivity. Maybe in this example, I'm specifically looking for an invoice. I don't know the invoice number, but I do know that the invoice I'm looking for was from December of last year. So I'm going to do a date range search, December the 1st through the 31st of 2015 for this vendor productivity. And when I hit search, I'll get back a search results that shows me all of the invoices that meet the search criteria I've entered. I want to see if this particular invoice has been paid, so I open it up. Now I can see the invoice. I can see that it's AP approved. That's my confirmation that the invoice has been passed from PN3 into Dynamics SL. The thing that I'm most concerned about in this case is to see if it's been paid. I can come over here to the payment fields. It will show me not only if it was paid, but how. It says this was paid via ACH. This is the payment number, and this is the payment date. So as a user, I can see this information in PN3 as long as your security gives me access to the transaction. Now, this demonstration really wasn't intended to get into all of the PN3 features. It was designed to give you enough of an understanding of PN3 to determine if it might meet your requirements. We want to focus on being an intuitive application, easy to use, therefore easy to deploy and replace a paper-based process or an electronic process that you have that does not seamlessly integrate with SL the way you want it to, or your users have not found it to be the most intuitive or user-friendly environment for processing AP. Let's come back and let's do a quick review. So in PN3, I can easily scan invoices and receive invoices electronically. There's also electronic payment requests and expense reimbursement forms. Automated routing based upon your policies and procedures. Email alerts and reminders. Coding and approvals. Budget integration. Real-time invoice status. You'll never have to guess where any invoices are. There's no more paper to file. Online search of invoices, payment requests, and expense reports. You can track contract financials and those documents. Online storage and retrieval of vendor documents. I didn't demonstrate this, but you can store vendor W-9 and other correspondence, and you can really lock that down, meaning you can control who has access to those transactions. There you can put vendor contacts and other vendor information. My contact information and my colleague Michelle Dome's contact information is on this last slide. I want to thank you for joining us in this morning's session. And please feel free to reach out if you have any additional questions about PN3, how it integrates with Dynamics SL, or if you'd like to do a one-on-one demonstration where we can answer the specific questions you have about PN3. Thank you very much and have a great day.